Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss Budget 2013 with you here today. And first of all, I want to thank everyone in this room for the approach you take to our great province. You create so many jobs, the entrepreneurship, the innovation. What we're seeing in our province is in great part due to the people in this room and the energy that you devote. The one thing that binds us all together, though, is a love for the province and for our people. In this year's budget, and it was a difficult budget, no question, we outlined our long-term plan to protect the financial position of the province while trying to still protect the services that people told us during the pre-budget consultations were so important, especially healthcare and education. But as you've seen from the last couple of weeks, it's certainly a difficult situation to please everyone. And we knew during the budget process that there would be outcries and there would be criticism of the budget. So although we may not be able to pinpoint exactly where it would take place, we knew that would come. But there's a couple of areas that I want to talk to you about today, especially in your capacities, is that I'm going to talk about how we went from a projected $1.6 billion deficit to a $563.8 million deficit. And that seems to be forgotten, by the way, in the mix, that the deficit is still $563 million projected for this year. We're going to talk a little bit about I'm going to talk a little bit about the sustainability plan and where we plan to go from here. I'll talk a little bit about what it means to be a half province, because there seems to be some confusion as to what exactly that term encompasses. And I will talk about what I consider to be, in my role as the Minister of Finance, one of the most important issues facing our province, and that is our unfunded pension liability. So let me start first by talking a little bit about the deficit. I became the Minister of Finance on January 16th. That was after we finished Muskrat Falls, so the Premier decided to give me a break and put me in finance to deal with the budget and the collective bargaining process. So within a few weeks of that appointment, though, I became aware that we were facing a much more serious deficit than we thought. That the deficit for the upcoming year was projected to be $1.6 billion. That number, however, had been known to my predecessor, the previous minister, and because of the startling nature of the number, work was ongoing to try to determine the accuracy of the same. So I felt, having regard to the way we've been criticized for being less than open and transparent, that in the interests of the public knowing what's going on, that we should put that number out there. So that figure of $1.6 billion was released to the public, not to manipulate the unions or to manufacture a crisis, but because it was important that people know the fiscal situation. But then, of course, when we come in on Budget Day on March 26th and say, oh, we've magically found, that's the way some people termed it, $1 billion, the skepticism was rampant, and there was criticism for that. But from those of you in this room, especially anyone involved in the oil and gas business, you know the volatility and the variability that exists on a day-to-day basis. That $1 billion was comprised essentially of two sets of numbers, and I'll break it down a little bit further. We found $695 million in increased revenue, and our core mandate review, or our expenditure reduction, resulted in a decrease of approximately another $400 million. Now, the oil royalties increased, and this is the truth. Coming from a lawyer and a politician, I'm not sure what weight you give to that, but in any event, the irony struck me when I said it. But when we receive from the CNLOPB production numbers twice a year, and I'll get into this a little bit later, one set of numbers in January and one set in June. And we've seen great divergence over the years in terms of those production numbers. So numbers came in as for our budget process, and the officials in my department did great work and noticed certain anomalies there in terms of the numbers. So they went back and pushed at the CNLPB, and lo and behold, the CNLPB numbers were increased by 8 million barrels of oil. That added up to approximately $265 million, right there, just like that. Then The new chair and vice chair of the CNLPB came to see me sometime in March and said, we think we have another 80 million barrels of oil in Terra Nova. And I said, thank you very much. Do you have anything for this year? They said, yes, we have another million barrels for you. And this is, again, the way it happened. That's another $40 to $50 million. The federal government changes its methodology for determining HST. That results in approximately another $150 million. The deal with Vale Inco, which we couldn't talk about at the time, has increased our mining taxes to approximately $150 million. And then we had an increase in corporate and personal income tax. So as we're preparing for the budget, the numbers are changing, and the increased oil production. But as Dennis said earlier, that's one of the difficulties with an economy that's based on oil. When the price of oil, and ours is obviously the Brent crude, goes up $1, we make $25 million. When the exchange rate goes down a cent, we make another $27 million. So every day, our numbers are changing. As the Minister of Natural Resources, I spent a lot of time on trying to determine how short-term predictions. Well, when I got into the Department of Finance this time, I realized production is key. We also have to know how our production is going to work. So we've seen these wide swings in the past. I just want to give you a couple of quick examples to show you that unfortunately, or fortunately, depends how you look at some of this, this is not unusual. In budget 2010, it was estimated that there would be a $194 million deficit for the upcoming year. At the end of the year, there was an actual surplus of $593 million, a change of more than $700 million. In budget 2011, a $59 million surplus was projected. At mid-year, this was now $755. At the end of the year, $883 million, a change of more than $800 million. So you can see that the budgeting process with numbers like this becomes very difficult. And in budget 2012, we went from a deficit of $258 at budget to $725 million deficit at mid-year to $430. So the other thing that people miss, we picked up another $300 million off last year's deficit. So what I'm trying to establish is the volatility and variability in oil revenues makes it very difficult to budget. So when I got there, I said, well, what process can we put in place? And everyone will remember last year the $124 a barrel prediction and the criticism that was put out there for that. Well, Brent averaged 112, I think, on the year. And if Brent averages 112 this year, based on 105 prediction, another $150 million. So I'm not going to say that this is unwelcome, but in terms of the budgeting process and giving credibility to the budgeting process, I felt that we had to look at a new methodology. How can we come up with figures that the public can trust, having regard to the volatility? So this year, we chose a figure of $105 Brent per barrel. And we put that in the next 3 years. We hired Dr. Wade Locke, a leading economist at MUN, as our advisor during the budget cycle. Dr. Locke suggested that 107 was a good number. Pyra, our energy advisor in New York, said, well, 110 is probably a good number. Sproul, GLJ, EIA, Consensus, all had higher numbers. So we went at 105 and said, that seems to be a good number. I would suggest to you that that is a conservative number. But having regard to that volatility, we're within the range on that number. Now, can something happen that can drive it down to $70 a barrel? Very unlikely. Can something happen that can drive it to $150 a barrel? While unlikely, it can certainly happen, and all it has to do is that there's a war in Iran that takes 2.5 million barrels a day out of the market. So I got to look at the production data and said, well, how do we figure this out if these numbers are swinging like this? And I'll give you an example. In 2011-12 fiscal year, the projections for oil changed by 18.72 million barrels over 6 months. Good news for us, but better that we knew it in January for doing our budget. In 2010-11, we had an $8.65 million barrel change. So the CNLPB gives us our numbers twice a year, in January and June. We base our budgets based on that, and that's why we haven't been close. So the fact that we weren't close this year shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but with a new methodology in terms of the projection, the pricing and projection, we're working with CNLPB to come up with a new method. So you take that into account, that's where we found $1 billion. Now, as the finance minister, I would much rather be in that position to be in the position of some of our provinces who don't have that same resource. But as Dennis has indicated, it certainly highlights the volatility and the need to diversify our economy. The second major arm of our reduction, though, was the core mandate review, where we looked at government. All of you here who run a business, you look at efficiencies. You look at how can I effectively deliver the services in the best way possible. But you also look at the money. You're paying people to work. You're paying for services, and people are paying you. So we looked at, is there duplication here? Have things changed in the last 20 years? Look at the changes in the business world. Yet has government changed with it? Do we need as many people as we have? And we have approximately 9,000 employees in core public service, or our 16 departments, and approximately 45,000 employees government-wide when you look at 13,000 employees in Eastern Health, approximately 6,000 teachers, the other health authorities. So 45,000 people. So I don't think you need to be an economist or a chartered accountant, of which I'm neither. But if you take a pragmatic and practical approach, then you realize that if you're spending more money than you're bringing in, you're going to get in trouble if you continue that, whether it's running your home, your business, or a government. And so that's the approach we take. Now, we recognize that we're dealing with people's lives. And I can assure you that this has not been a pleasant task for any of us. This has been a tough task for all ministers, and especially the Premier, as we sat around that room figuring how do we ensure a sustainable future for our children and grandchildren. That meant, unfortunately, where 55% of your expenditures, of your revenues, excuse me, are going towards payroll and benefits, that there's going to be layoffs. Some of it is as high as 70% in terms of human resources in some of our departments. So in reviewing this, we came up with another $410 million, which is a significant amount of money, and it nets out to be about $300 million going to the deficit. We've also brought in attrition management guidelines, the voluntary retirement package announced in March. We've suspended recruitment activities for now. We looked at identifying funded vacant positions that exist in government and eliminating them. So when you look at the layoffs in the core public service, there are approximately 450. There was approximately another 485, and another 450 approximately outside, so for 935 positions people laid off. So that's less than 2%, but still the impact on the individuals we recognize is very significant. But we still have more work to do. We can't simply say, now we've done it this year and we're taking heat, so let's go back to the way things were always done. We have significant deficit the following year, and then we plan to return to surplus 2 years out. During all of this, people have said two things. Well, one, we're a half province, and so we should be flush with cash. And secondly, what'd you do with all the money? So let's look at what it means to be a half province. What it means is that we can stand with pride in this great country and say we have reached now the point where we are contributing to the country as opposed to simply receiving. It means that we can pay our own way. But the practical reality means we have less money because we no longer receive equalization payments. Newfoundland and Labrador today receives federal transfers in terms of the Canada Health Transfer and the Canada Social Transfer of approximately $700 million. Quebec receives federal payments, equalization, Canada Health Transfer, Canada's social transfer of $17 to $18 billion. Now, you just think of that and think of where we are today. But it doesn't mean that we are rich. The other paradox or dichotomy is, how can we have such a red-hot economy, as all of you in this room will attest to, and yet government revenues are down? Well, we're seeing it in Alberta. The wealthiest province in the country is now going through the same thing. Their expenditures have outpaced their revenues, and they've got to hold back. Every other province, well, there's a couple of provinces that say they have balanced budgets, but easy, I guess, to balance a budget in Quebec when you get $18 billion from the federal government. Nova Scotia is balancing a budget, again, $1.5 billion transfer payments, and BC. Saskatchewan has a true surplus. So we're at the stage where we now have to continue. We've endured the pain, and will continue to endure the pain of the last few weeks. We've done well throughout the recession. I mean, if you look at the stimulus program that existed, we weathered that economic storm fairly well. We have invested significantly in healthcare, and you can see that recently in a report that showed our wait times. We're now leading the country in a number of areas and second in others. We're investing $1 billion this year to support children and families. We have lowered taxes by $500 million since 2007. That's money that's going into the pocket of average Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, besides the people in this room, and allowing them to have more money to spend. We have the most competitive tax regime in Atlantic Canada. We have the lowest tuition rates in the country. We are second in the country in weekly earnings. We have more people working today than ever. And I could go on, but a lot of that's in the budget speech and accompanying documents. So then the second question becomes, well, what'd you do with all of this oil money? Well, for those of you who remember prior to 2003, there wasn't a whole lot of construction going on in this province. There weren't a whole lot of schools and hospitals and long-term care facilities built. A couple of startling statistics. From 2000 to 2012, our healthcare budget grew by 142%, from $1.2 billion to $2.9 billion. Our education budget grew from $700 million to $1.2 billion, a 71% growth. MUN's budget tripled, and with tuition remaining the lowest in the country. In 2003, 2004, approximately $154 million was invested in infrastructure. Today, that's $744 million, an increase of 383%. We've decreased taxes, as I've said. We've lost equalization, which is good, which is bad. We no longer get Atlantic Accord payments. The public service received wage increases of more than 28% since 2006. That adds up $500 million a year to your expenditures. Oil production is up and down, and we've talked about that. In the last 2 years, in 2012, our new spending growth is approximately 2.2%, and 1.5% new spending projected in budget 2013. We've been criticized for decisions, and again, as I said, that was to be expected. But the Board of Trade, I think everyone in this room, and I thank Dennis for his comments, support and know what we are trying to do. We may be sacrificing today's political gains for the future of our children and grandchildren, but the Premier and our Cabinet and our government is willing to do that. Being elected in politics doesn't simply mean you throw the right way to do things out the door and you do things to get votes. We have been elected to do the right thing, and we will continue to do that. Now, in the budget, sometimes you make a $10,000 reduction, it can be $1 million. The reaction can be emotional, can be visceral, it can be justified, and you'll see that when brought to the Premier's attention on the extent of justice cuts, there were changes made. But that doesn't mean that everyone now can protest and we'll change the approach we've taken. It can't work like that. Now, we've spent the money in rebuilding the province. And I've said publicly, I've said in the House of Assembly, which hospital shouldn't we have built? Which school shouldn't we have built? Which road shouldn't we have paved? And inevitably, no one answers it. Because when you rebuild a province to allow for the economy that we have today, it costs money. But we live in a vast province with a relatively small population and a lot of rural communities. Everyone wants schools and hospitals that are accessible. I'm going to put this in perspective for you. This is an interesting statistic. We have 15 hospitals in the province, the provincial health care centre, 22 community health centres, 114 community clinics, and 20 long-term care facilities. Hamilton, with the same population, has 3 hospitals. So the cost of health care with our aging demographic adds significantly. In terms of the sustainability plan, year 1 is our reduction process. Year 2 will be a review of the regional health authorities, Memorial, and Kona, with a view to determining, are we delivering services as efficiently and as effectively as possible? We are currently looking at the unfunded pension liabilities. Year 3 will return to surplus. So when we talk about debt, people in this room know one basic fact: debt costs money. Our debt servicing costs, if you look at our sustainability plan, they're outlined there, but it's still costing $800 million a year. Now, look what you could do with $800 million a year. And we're paying off the bonds, by the way, that were taken out. We haven't borrowed in years, but these are bonds that were taken out in the early 90s, I think it's back as far as the late 80s, with 10 and 12, 15% interest rates. So that's the money we're paying. Look what you could do with that. Then, as the Auditor General has indicated, and it's the elephant in the room for us in any event as a government, is the unfunded pension liability. But it's also the same across the country. Every province is looking at their pension liabilities. We have paid $3.3 billion into the unfunded pension liabilities since 2006. It's still down $5 billion. 2/3 of our debt is related to pension liabilities and post-retirement benefits. So we're going to work with the unions. We've hired pension consultants. We're looking at different models. We're examining what's going on in the country. We're going to work with the unions because it's their members' pensions that we want to protect. If you look at the Auditor General's reports, he talks about what will happen to the teachers' plan and the public service plan without intervention. So we're going to have discussions over the next period of time and hopefully come to a resolution. We're seeing joint management plans being utilized across the country, and I'm hoping that there will be fruitful discussions with the unions. So, as Dennis indicated earlier, oil and gas is great. It's what's allowed us to get to the stage where we are today, and it's what will allow us to continue with a bright future. But we also have to diversify our economy. That's one of the reasons that we think Muskrat Falls is such a great project, not only in terms of the work it creates, but that it will allow us to satisfy our own power needs with a made in Newfoundland and Labrador solution. We will continue to invest in economic development in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, in the fishery, in tourism. We will continue to make healthcare a priority. And this is one of the things we haven't heard much talk about from Budget 2013. But despite a suggestion by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the NDP, we did not raise taxes in personal income tax or corporate income tax in Budget 2013. We will maintain our current levels of personal income taxes and business taxes because we need that competitive tax environment. As Dennis talked about earlier, we need more workers, and a competitive tax environment certainly helps to attract them. Also, besides the tax the rich, platform of this group and the NDP, it was also, well, just tear up the contracts with the oil companies. So kill the goose that's laid the golden egg. We will not do that. We have signed contracts and written agreements with our partners in oil and mining industries and other corporations, and we will certainly not even contemplate changes to that because it might be politically popular to do that. That is not going to happen with our government. There was a lot of good news in the budget, but unfortunately you don't hear about all the monies we're continued spending on education, on health care. And again, that's not unusual in terms of where we are. So, in closing, it has been a difficult budget process, and since the budget has been a difficult few weeks. But one of the reasons it's been difficult is because sometimes, or maybe many times, doing the right thing is not the politically popular thing. Also, as I've indicated, none of us take the pleasure in this. Sharon asked me earlier, and she said, this question is probably asked a lot, do you enjoy politics? Or sometimes people will say, do you still enjoy politics? I can't say I've ever enjoyed politics. I find it interesting, and I find it continuously shifting from going from the fat into the fire, whether it be health to Muskrat Falls to finance. It's interesting. But I also feel, and maybe I'm being naive, and maybe I'm being a little too ideological here, but the decisions we make today will set the path for the future, for our children and grandchildren. If you look at how far we've come in this province since 1949, if you look at the people in this room today, people who can go anywhere in this country, hold your heads up high, talk to your peers across this country. And do we hear any more jokes anymore about dealing with Newfoundlanders and Labradorians? Not a chance. But that path has to be maintained. And if we do not ensure fiscal responsibility, then we will be back to those days of debt that will burden our children and grandchildren with an impossible burden. Because not only does debt cost money, our bond rating agencies will downgrade our credit, and it will cost more money to borrow. So we are trying to transition our government to a more effective delivery of programs, but that's never easy. So the easiest thing sometimes for politicians to do nothing. Let it continue, let it be someone else's problem. But that's an abdication of responsibility. That's not what we were elected for, and that's not what our Premier is going to do. It's been very unfair over the last number of weeks, the kinds of attacks that our Premier has been subjected to, many of a very personal nature. The Premier has shown great leadership. She knew where we were in the polls. She has said on previous occasions, we will not govern by polls. To bring in a tough budget in the midst of that shows the type of leadership and courage that we need. As politicians, we are elected to do what's in the best interests of the province. We feel, and the Premier feels, that we are making the right decisions. Decisions which will ensure that bright and prosperous future for our children and grandchildren. We feel that Budget 2013 reflects a balanced approach to reducing spending to a necessary level while protecting core areas. And these are the areas that the public told us they wanted to protect. Our 10-year sustainability plan sets out where we're going to in the future with the goal of reducing net debt per capita to a Canadian-wide average. So we're making the right decisions today to protect the future of our province. And as with Muskrat Falls, I am comfortable that history will prove that we have made the right decision. Thank you very much.